Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. We've got a great panel coming up. I'd like to invite the panelists to come up on stage. We're going to be talking about unlikely allies, folks who find ways to work together and get things done. Let me take a minute to introduce the impressive and very well-known people in the room, just so you know, and also to pass on the favor of asking about important first teachers. To my immediate left, I've got MaryEllen and Elia, who was for a long time the superintendent of the 8th largest school district in Florida, Hillsborough, which is where Tampa is. And MaryEllen, tell us about your first teacher, or your most important teacher.
So, my most important teacher was Sister Mary Aloysius. So, anybody else have a Sister Mary?
Yeah. Should we leave it at that?
No. No. I got to tell you why she was so great.
Okay.
So I was, I'm the fourth child. I'm the only girl, the youngest. And when I went to school, I always wanted to be better than my brothers, so I wanted to do everything they did, so I read. And so I went to school, and in second grade, I just loved to read. And the reading time in second grade wasn't very long. Right. So I wanted to read all the time. And Sister Mary Aloysius let me read. She let me read all the time. She let me do a lot of other things, and she let me go to other classrooms and find books that I was interested in reading. And it was an important thing in my life. I became really a strong reader because of those early years. And so, Sister Mary, you're great.
Amazing. To MaryEllen's left is Jean Clements. Jean is the 14-year president of the Hillsborough Classroom Teachers Association. Do you want to tell us about a teacher?
You caused me a lot of angst with this assignment last night because I had to rethink what I know now about my life and my teachers back then, and who would I say now really did have the biggest influence and the best influence. And I really surprised myself with who I came up with, because it's Mr. Ralph Lloyd Carson, who was the department head for social studies at my high school. I was always that really smart kid who was polite and well-behaved and usually was a great student, and teachers typically liked me a lot. By high school, I was quite a radical, and I was a fierce advocate for civil rights and human rights and social justice and student rights. And by my senior year, I was a bit cocky, maybe, I was kind of done with the school thing, the high school thing, and I signed up for a lot of electives in social studies, and Mr. Carson was the teacher of several of them and sat in on many of the others. And he called me out one day on my sort of youthful, cocky arrogance, and he asked me if he could talk to me after class. I was very good at arguing against what I thought were injustices by the government and social and religious institutions, and I had become very negative and critical. And he suggested that it wasn't quite that simple, that it was, there were a lot more complicated issues to bear, and that it wasn't necessarily accurate or fair to be always so critical. And of course I just thought he was pompous and arrogant and old-fashioned, but it embarrassed me. I realized he was right, and he quickly squashed in me that tendency to be overly negative, that the issues are more complicated than that, and that it would impede my ability to communicate my message and win over the people I most needed to win if I was not more balanced and fair in my role as a rebel and fierce advocate for.
That's very interesting, especially given what we're up here to talk about. Next up is Bill Hammond, the president and CEO of the Texas Association of Business and Chambers of Commerce. Bill, tell us about a teacher.
Well, I think Mr. Williams in high school, he actually went to Williams. That's one of the reasons I remember him. And he taught a semester course in Russian. It was not Russian, the language, but Russia, the country. And also a semester-long course in economics. And I think that spurred my interest in public policy in general. And was part of the way that I got to where I am today.
Excellent. Richard Rhodes is the president of the Austin, Texas Community College. Tell us about a favorite teacher or a most impactful teacher.
Okay. When I was in high school, I described myself as a distracted student that, whether it was sports or cars or girls, everything kind of got in the way of being a good student. And I graduated, by some measure of miracle, I graduated from high school and I went to my local community college. And my teacher there, who taught history, was a guy named David Townsend. And because I came as a distracted student into higher education, he taught me that I could no longer be a distracted student if I wanted to be successful. But he also invested time in me to make sure that I understood that I belonged in higher education, that I could be successful, and that there was a path for me through that. So David Townsend, who happened to be a high school teacher, but taught as an adjunct professor at the local community college, made the biggest difference for me.
That's great, amazing stories. So we're here to talk a little bit about unlikely allies, but before we do, we need to talk about conflict. Conflict and opposition are pretty much everywhere, and it's easy to think that that is all that there is. Conflict is easy, safe. It's not hard to find people who want to inflame the conflict. Sometimes I feel like I've unfortunately been a part of that. You've got the typical sides or tribes that get set up. Management versus labor, Democrats versus Republicans, Democrats versus Democrats, charters versus districts, all sorts of things out there. But they're not as a universal. Those intractable seeming conflicts aren't as universal, it turns out, and it's important to remember times where people have found amazing ways to work together. These periods of time don't always last forever, but it's during these periods where unlikely allies can come together that progress gets made. Sometimes there's pushback and things go back for a little while, and sometimes the progress continues later or pops up in another place. I spent a little time last night trying to think of examples of unlikely allies other than the folks up here, which we're going to hear about. You all may have some examples as well. In education, I think about No Child Left Behind. Ted Kennedy and George Miller and John Boehner and George Bush putting together a massive education law. In the present time, you've got districts and charters seeming to work pretty well together in places like Denver. You've got the Common Core adoption process early on, and places like California where there's been much less attention paid, but much more positive progress than in other places that seem to get all the attention. So it's important and good to remember that those things can happen, and you all and people like me need to try to remind ourselves and others about those moments where people can work together like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the situation in Hillsborough and the situation in Austin in Texas. We've got a K-12 and a post-secondary story up here. Let's start first, MaryEllen, with the situation, the challenges that you faced with a teacher evaluation and support system that hadn't changed much and by all accounts wasn't doing very much for teachers in your district.
Right, so about 10 years ago, I was appointed superintendent in Hillsborough, a very large district, but I had been there for a number of years and been in a lot of jobs. So I was, very friendly, kind of knew the people that you had to get to make things happen. Certainly our union was one of those groups. So when I became superintendent, the first thing that you have to think about is, what are we going to do to really move the needle for kids? And we had already started doing some things, getting some committees together of people from the union and the district to talk about how we could craft something and what it would look like. And The whole difficulty, I think, that I see, and I'm now in New York and I'm seeing it very obviously, is that very often people don't respect that other side, right? I happen to have been a union member both in New York for 17 years and then in Hillsborough in the very union that I was working with. And I think it was really important that we try to figure out things together. One of the first things that happened was the state came out with a teacher incentive program called MAP. And I called Jean and the executive director at the union and said, there's about $10 million that's available for teachers. It's only going to go to teachers if we can figure out how to get it to them and fit through these hoops that the state has set up. There were problems with the MAP program, and both of us realized it. But it was more, as a realist, let's get things done. We're either going to be able to get additional funding for the teachers in Hillsborough or not.
Right.
And we worked together.
It's nice to have some state money to be
An incentive.
candy for that. Bill, you started out not with candy, but with vinegar. You want to tell us a little bit about what you saw when you looked at Austin Community College and some of the other community colleges and what you did?
Well, sure. I mean, the issue for us is always the workforce. We have 300,000 skills gap openings in Texas. You know, we have people without jobs and jobs without people. And so our issue is getting a better educated workforce. And it was our feeling that the graduation rates, the success rates for community and four-year schools was simply not satisfactory. We worked with CompleteCollege.org and looked at the numbers, and we can argue about the numbers forever. But what I do want to emphasize is not about the exact numbers, it's about the direction of the numbers, what's happening in terms of increase in productivity. So one of the solutions that was proposed to have some money, outcomes-based funding. And currently in Texas, the money, or before this, the money that the schools received was based on kids sitting in the classroom on the 12th day. It mattered not what happened on the 13th day. So we thought this was a good idea. We worked with other groups. We tried to advance it for a couple sessions. We got nowhere. The legislature, of which I'm a recovering member, is very complacent about the performance of public institutions, in my opinion, in general, and it's very disappointing to us. So having failed a couple of times, I came up with the idea of a billboard. And we actually rented a billboard for one day in Austin and one day in Dallas, and we posted, based on the coordinating board's numbers, the 3-year graduation rate. Well, we are the State Chamber of Commerce. Needless to say, a lot of people got upset with us. You know, I don't really care. I mean, I'm not running for office or anything like that at this point. And, you know, some chambers quit. The community colleges raised hell. They got mad at us because they thought it was a false portrayal of where they were. But what happened was, as a result of that, based on the leadership of people like Dr. Rhodes and others, we sat down with 8 community college presidents soon thereafter. And the coordinating board in Texas had set up a metrics for outcomes-based funding, which, you know, is going to be a reasonable, well, I'll let Dr. Rhodes comment on how reasonable it is, but I think it was achievable and reasonable. And basically our message to the community colleges was that if you go over to the coordinating board and you work a deal out with them, and we pass it into law, we're going to be off your case. And they saw the beauty in that, because several of them told me afterwards that they didn't want billboards in their home, in their home counties. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. Before I forget, what was do you recall the number on the billboard for Austin?
4%?
4%.
I'm told that a copy of the billboard is here in the building, and if anyone wants to see it.
Well, and you know, we use the numbers from the coordinating board, which are the numbers that the schools give to the, and there's all kinds of arguments. I'm going to be the first one to say, look, you know, what happens after that? Does basket weaving count? You know, if you transfer to another school, on and on and on. All of those factors are correct, but we're not getting the job done. It's just like with the four-year schools in Texas. If 50% of our four-year students graduate in 6 years. That doesn't work for them. It doesn't work for the state.
Right.
Texas will not be competitive in the future if we don't have an educated workforce.
Right.
So arguing about the preciseness of the numbers to me is totally irrelevant. Are we increasing our productivity by 5 or 6% over time every year so that we meet the needs of the employers in the future? One of the biggest problems is the aging workforce.
Right.
The average plumber in Texas is 56 years old. They look like me, they're old and white. And they're not being replaced because we're not as successful as we need to be at the technical community and four-year schools.
Right. Gene Clements, you are in a position that traditionally, at least in some places I've been to, is set up to be antagonistic, is set up to be oppositional, management and labor. You managed, as far as I can tell, to sort of bypass or not give in to that pressure. Tell us a little bit about how you responded to MaryEllen's proposal and what allowed you to work with her.
So first of all, I have to say I resent the assumption that we should be unlikely allies. We're education professionals. We bring a lot of expertise. There is no decision about how and what we teach our kids and how we run our schools and district that would not be better if it was made by all the people that are involved, your teachers who are experts in the classroom and have that experience and bring it to bear. Right. And that is how we always both approached things. We both were career educators. We both had spent a lot of time in the same district. I knew of MaryEllen and her rise to the position of superintendent, and she was well respected. Our assumption was we should get together to work things out. Mm-hmm. We had significant challenges coming from the legislature, right. Things that neither one of us were approving of or thought were the wisest and smartest way to impose things into our schools and districts. So it was a natural for us to seek each other out and say, how do we play this? How do we take advantage of $10.8 million that's going to go into the pockets of my teachers and into our community? How do we make this work? And how do we include a lot of teachers in the discussion to come up with the best and smartest way to implement laws that were not well thought out?
How did you, just to get specific, because it's not impossible, but it's not also standard for a district superintendent and a union president to work together like this. What did you do specifically to help your team and your members understand that this wasn't just going along?
We talked to them. We included them. Mm-hmm. We let them know what we were facing from the legislature, what the alternatives were, what the options were. In the end, when we developed this first performance pay plan that the legislature gave $10.8 million for that could be spent no other way, right. Once we designed the best thing we could that we thought was the fairest possible, we put it out there for a standalone ratification. And we said clearly, this is not perfect, it can't be. It's based on flawed premises. But 1 out of 3 of our teachers will get this, and right. It won't be the same every year. And vote it up, vote it down. My life would be simpler if you vote it down, but it's $10.8 million. So
what was the vote?
It was like 75, 80% in favor of doing it.
Very nice. Richard Rhodes, you got a billboard outside of town, in town, some cameras, I'm guessing some reporters, some phone calls coming in. What was your reaction to this pressurizing? And how did you find a way not to just retreat into a corner?
Well, I think it was yesterday, Melinda Gates said, when you're uncomfortable, that's when learning really begins. Believe me, I was very uncomfortable. Yeah. So I was learning. I think I had been on the job as the president of Austin Community College about a month when the billboard showed up. And so my first thought was, welcome to Austin, Texas. My second thought was, you kind of have this tendency, you want to become defensive and defend it. But the third thought was, when I look at that rate, first of all, I had to correct the metric. It wasn't 4%, it was actually 3.9%. But then, you take a step back and you think, am I satisfied with this? This is inexcusable. Right. We cannot accept this. Right. And so we have to commit to change. The good thing about it was, being a new president, it gave me that leverage to actually begin making change. It gave me that opportunity to create internal and external conversations about metrics and the use of metrics, the use of data. It gave me that opportunity to say, are we providing the right tools to our faculty, to our staff, so that they can be successful in the classroom? And do our faculty and staff even know what the data are? Mm-hmm. And so have we shared that data with them so that they know what the metrics are, what the persistence rates are from semester to semester, completion rates for one semester? Did the students finish all the classes they signed up for? Because as Bill said, historically in Texas, after the 12th class day, that's the census date. And so when we focused on getting students in the door, we didn't do a good job about making sure that they achieved their dreams and they exited with a credential into the workforce. So it gave me that opportunity for a compelling urgency, internally and externally, and a cause for conversation about metrics. And then, just coincidentally, Texas was a part of Completion by Design, funded by the Gates Foundation. And so as a part of that, we created what's called the Texas Student Success Council, an advocacy group of individuals from throughout the state of Texas. I happen to chair that group, but it was community college leaders, but it was also foundations, chief information officers. We included people from the legislature, from K-12, so we had and from the university. So we had this large, disparate group of voices. Sometimes when I say that, people think you mean a desperate group of voices. And some of us were desperate. But I remember one thing in particular, and that is, as that was created, and we were looking at membership for that group, John Fitzpatrick from Educate Texas, who came to me and he said, "Richard, I think you ought to invite Bill Hammond to be one of those disparate voices on the council." Huh. And my first reaction, in all honesty, was, "You've got to be kidding." My second response was, if we don't have his voice at the table, we're not going to get the full audience here and the full discussion. So we did. And then as a result of that, we could go to the legislature. We had these conversations as a part of the council, and Bill's voice was important. And when we talk about performance-based funding, we went arm in arm to the legislature. Matter of fact, we signed letters to legislators together to say we want performance-based funding for community colleges in the state of Texas. And I remember a specific legislator looked at that and said, "Are you kidding me? This is signed by both Richard Rhodes and Bill Hammond. They must be serious."
Right. That's powerful stuff. When you had the success with the incentive program, you weren't done. You still had a lot of things that you wanted to do, including working on a teacher evaluation program that sounds like it was the once-a-year checkbox kind of thing that a lot of districts have. And so you kept pushing.
Right.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, it was obvious. I mean, our school district was, we were okay. Our kids weren't doing really, really well. I mean, really smart kids were doing really well, but we really didn't move the mark, and we had major achievement gaps. And so, we worked together. It was working on the MAP program from the state was a good way to start this relationship of constantly meeting. I mean, I would meet with the union leaders and the board, and we would talk through issues, right? And then we started this agenda to, okay, let's now take what we're doing and let's find the best models, let's review them. And when I say let's do that, we were doing it together. So it was staff from the district office, principals, as well as all the union people and teachers that were on it. And then we were approached by the Gates Foundation to see if we were interested in applying for one of the deep dive districts. And we went through a process that was about 6 months total. And ultimately, we received that district, that funding for it, and started this journey to together come up with a strong evaluation for teachers and some really key components that were different. You know, we had peer evaluators for every teacher, multiple observations by both the peer and the principal. And then ultimately, how did we come up with this movement of really improving what happens in the classroom? The bottom line is, we couldn't get anywhere if we didn't somehow constantly improve what was happening in our classroom. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but we worked on it together. And I think ultimately, the communication is a huge part of that. We had a communication plan for virtually everything we did. Jean and the union would communicate, I would communicate. We would have union leaders from every school meet, and we'd have meetings there. Every time there was an issue, we tried to respond to it, and we had a group of teachers that were meeting like initially once a week, and then maybe once every other week, and then once a month, to just oversee everything that was happening and give feedback.
Right. With that money hanging out there, or the possibility of it, and with the desire to make things better for kids in the district, I can imagine I would have been really tempted to rush. Maybe see if I could get a letter signed and just sort of rush the process. You were obviously interested and excited in pursuing the possibility of the EET grant. Mm-hmm. How did you push but not rush?
Well, we had timelines, and we just worked. I mean, there were constant meetings. We started the meetings, and most of you won't believe this, but at 6 a.m. Wow. We would get together. We'd have our meetings, and then we'd go on to the day. And on some of those meetings, you know, everybody doesn't agree on everything. We had to work through the components of it, and we all said, this is our proposal, this is what we want to do. But we were pretty tight that if we saw something that wasn't working, we had to change it. I would say that was a big part of it.
Very committed to flexibility.
Right. Bill, how did you figure out ways to push but not push too hard, push but not break?
Well, I mean, we used a billboard again last fall. It didn't work. We're trying to get outcomes-based funding for the four-year schools, and all of them publicly stated their support for us. And then, of course, went around behind, I call it crawfish, and went around behind and killed it. Right. UTSA has about a 25% graduation rate for entering freshmen in 6 years. Right. That doesn't work for those kids. The state of Texas has now established a goal of 60 by 30, which means that 60% of our 25 to 35-year-olds would have something beyond high school by the year 2030. Right. Today, that number is about 38%. You know, if it's going to work, if it's going to continue to work in America or in Texas, I don't really care that much about the rest of America, but in Texas, we're going to have a better educated workforce. So there's two reasons I'm here today. One is my good friend, Dr. Rhodes, called me up and invited me. And the other was John Fitzpatrick promised the largest grant ever given by the Gates Foundation to publicize the goal of 60 by 30 and make sure that everybody in Texas realize what's at stake, so that we will have not a billboard, but an army of Texans demanding increased performance by our institutions of education, pre-K through 20 or whatever the hell it is now, you know, across the board, because we simply have to do better. You know, to me, the ultimate question, public policy, is, will children born in poverty die in poverty?
Right, right.
And that's what this is about to me.
I hear... I hear and share your urgency, but the billboard didn't work the second time.
No, it didn't.
So what do you wish you'd done differently? What could you have done differently?
Well, I mean, one thing that Dr. Rhodes didn't mention, we had a champion in the legislature. Dan Branch from Dallas was chairman of House Higher Education. Right. And he was a champion of this for a long time, and had, you know, he always said, we're doing better, but we need to do better faster. And unfortunately, he ran for Attorney General and lost. So we lost our big advocate, and you know, just the complacency, in my mind, quite honestly, of legislators who are not concerned about the performance of public institutions. I think that's really a lot of it. They're cheerleaders for their local, I get that, more money for, Tarleton State, whatever. I get that, but at the same time, I think their job, they have a fiduciary responsibility to see that the schools are doing better, and I believe that they can do better. I mean, for me, this is really about the legislature tapping education on the shoulder and saying, come on, guys, we got to do better. That's really what this is about. It's about focusing the efforts, which is beginning to happen. It's happening at the community college level across the state that, this is not okay. If half the kids who show up at UTSA do not graduate in 6 years, that's not okay. So what are we doing today, tomorrow, and the next day to improve that number? That's what we're about.
Gene, you worked together to do the MAP incentive program. The Gates folks, you're talking with the Gates folks about, in the district about doing this bigger thing. But at times the Gates Foundation's presence can be controversial. I know that newspaper reporters and awful bloggers like to talk a lot about the Gates Foundation and other foundations. How did you maneuver and keep things moving forward?
Well, so first of all, our legislators weren't complacent. They were just wrong. Misguided and wrong. And it was absolutely inevitable that they were going to be imposing some serious changes to the structures of how we run our schools and evaluate schools and success. And so we were arrogant enough to believe we could do it better. And we're strongly committed to staying ahead of that curve and having the strongest voice and the most choice possible in what reforms would look like in Hillsborough County. We were absolutely certain we would make better decisions about that than the legislature. So any opportunity to work on that together, to have some significant funding to assist us in that venture, we looked at things we probably would never have if we hadn't had the Gates Grant opportunity. We developed an incredibly effective mentoring program for new teachers that is hugely successful. We developed new ways of looking at principal leadership and principal pipelines and how to develop the right kind of principal for the right kind of school and making better choices about who the leaders are specific to the needs of a particular school. So the Gates Foundation gave us the opportunity to do that far more thoughtfully, with a lot more expertise, and certainly with a substantial amount of money to help us work with partners and create positions that would help us internally to be able to design and develop better programs in advance of what the legislature would impose.
And then the legislature did impose.
Right.
And we were able to
we were
get
ahead
a
of it.
number of exemptions from what
But-
their bad stuff was, doing it our way. We had more time, we could be more thoughtful, and we had money to help us do it better. And so the impact of those changes has been far more effective and more fair than what the rest of the state has been experiencing under those laws.
Not to get too technical, but did you all go to the State House together? Did you have your own people work? Exemptions are hard to get. How did you get
Very
those things?
carefully.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of conversations with people who were no longer in office to help us, to help the legislatures who were sitting there and going to help to make any carve-outs happen for us. But it was a very important thing. I think it's a strong argument to say to the legislatures, we're further ahead than where you're even going to get districts in this state too. So just kind of lay off us.
Right.
And let us lead the charge here. And so we were able to get that. It was
But
pretty important.
We also tried to educate them that what they were doing was not going
Yeah.
to work. We tried to dissuade them from taking the tax they were taking. We tried to explain to them how what they were doing was going to fail and even cause us a lot of problem in being successful.
So Jean, through her kind of her channels through the state union, and I worked really closely through the superintendent's organization and directly with some of the legislators to have it be closer to what we were finding was a good approach.
But the State Superintendents Association and the State Association, they're trying to do things for everybody, right? So I'm curious about how they reacted to the idea, or how you brought them along. You two were unified, but you had other people who were either want you to do what everyone else is doing, or maybe everyone wants to do what you're doing.
So we had some conferences, and Gina and I sent out joint invitations to the union presidents in all the communities and for each of the counties, and to the superintendents, and said, you know, we're doing this presentation on the work that we've done, and if both of you come, we kind of made that an important factor. They had to both be there, or they couldn't get their hotel rooms. So for the most part, I think we had probably about 70% of this of the districts came. We talked about the things we were doing, and a lot of the teachers made presentations. So it was, you know, it was a way for them to see they could move their unions and their teachers to be part of the evaluation process. And a number of them, I think, so when this law passed, they said, well, if Hillsborough's got that carve out, why don't we? And the reality was they hadn't done a lot of the upfront work. So ultimately,
But they weren't
many of them picked up on a lot of the factors and things that we had already tested.
after the fact.
So
right.
it was definitely controversial in my world, very controversial in my world. And one of the things that I tried to tell my colleagues around the state, and certainly leadership in the state organization, is that to the extent we could be successful doing things any way different from what the state was mandating, that would give everybody else some foot in the door, some impetus and proof of the state's way may not be the best way and the right way. We lobbied vigorously against, and that helped as well in our organizations across the state, seeing us lobby against these laws being imposed on the state. But then we also said, if any way that we can be successful that is different from what the state is requiring will help all of us make the argument that the state should not be dictating things in this way.
So let me get this straight. You are lobbying against the law and lobbying for an exemption if it passes.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Richard, you've got it sounds like you managed to communicate internally and bring people along, introducing them to the idea of metrics and sharing information out that you did. Were you able to, what did the other community college presidents have to say? Did they respond similarly? Was your approach appealing to them?
Yeah, actually there are 50 community college districts in the state of Texas. Right. We had the conversation and we helped actually define the metrics that were recommended to the coordinating board. And we actually took a vote of all the 50 community college districts and unanimous support for performance-based funding for community colleges. And we sent that message to the legislators. So, you know, as Bill said, sometimes you say, you know, up front, yeah, we're in support of this, and then behind the scenes you kill it. We actually had the opportunity if we wanted to kill it, because legislators came to us and said, are you serious about this? Right. You know, we don't have to move forward with this. And we said, no, we are serious. So the community colleges 100% supported it. We helped define the metrics. We had the opportunity to go through and take a look at the metrics and make sure that they fit for all 50 community college districts, because we're all different. Some are very large urban districts, and then we've got some small rural districts, and we wanted to make sure that the metrics were right for all. And so that was a good process, good outcome. We're in our second year now with the use of performance-based funding, and we still support it.
If you don't mind doing a little Monday morning quarterbacking up here on stage, what was the difference between the community college process and what happened with the 4 years?
You're asking me?
No, I'm asking.
I'm sorry. I apologize. Go ahead.
You know, you can tell that Bill is not shy or bashful, and he probably actually has a better understanding of that than I do. But we came together and we said, When we take a look at the data, it's unacceptable to us as community colleges, and we want to change. And one of the best ways to change is to use data, to look at the metrics, and then to identify, disaggregate the data and take a look. Where are the disparity gaps? Where are the equity gaps? What causes that? Is it policy that stands in the way, whether it's state policy or agency policy or institutional policy? So what stands in the way of us being able to make sure that our students can achieve their dreams? And through that process, we know that we're not doing the job that we needed to get the students to, through, and into the workforce. I think, I've worked in a university environment before, and I've worked in the community college. It is much easier in a community college to turn the ship. Right. It is much harder in a university to do that. And I think that sometimes that bureaucracy kind of creates some hurdles, some roadblocks in that ability.
Right. Let's spend the last few minutes, if we can, giving the folks in the audience here and online some real concrete takeaways, things that people out in the world might do or might learn from your specific experiences, and also some sense of progress that you've made. MaryEllen, can I ask you to tell us what's the most concrete thing that if I were visiting the district, would see that's results, if I were a teacher or a parent or a student, that's something that I would see and be able to go get that from the work that you and Jean did together, and what the most important thing, maybe it was these 6 a.m. meetings, most important thing you did that allowed you to have this period of cooperation?
I think we've got in the district, in our schools, and particularly with our teacher groups, an opportunity where you would see like the concept of continuous improvement and reflection on what's happening in classrooms and the craft of teaching. I think you'd see that virtually in every one of our schools. Our teachers are really, they work hard together to get better. And I think that the principals, we were very involved as well with the Wallace Foundation that really helped us with principal development. And as Jean pointed out, that was a really key part of this. The principals have an equally, I think, very metric-driven evaluation that we put in place that kind of hooks with our teacher evaluation. And that was extremely helpful because they see the importance and therefore the teachers work on that whole attitude of what do I need to do to get better? And even when we have places where things are going very well, they can still do better.
And what about an alliance strategy?
An alliance, I think that the biggest takeaway that I had from Hillsborough and now moving into New York State is that it is absolutely critical to work with the teachers and the principals across the state and across each district to work together and to say you cannot get this done if you're in a constant battle. And you really have to be able to say we're going to work, we're going to make this work, and we're going to give and take. Everybody doesn't always agree, but we move forward.
Jean, how about you? What's the thing that you would point to in a Hillsborough school that would let me visiting know of the concrete improvements or changes that you've made, and what would you advise to the folks out here is the thing that made it possible?
We've been a growing district for many years, so we hire a lot of new teachers every year. And that has always been a drain on each school, trying to compensate for bringing on so many new people in a year and receiving their students afterwards. So I think in every school, there is a great comfort and a great confidence in the quality of teaching in our first, second, and third year teachers that we didn't have before. It's
because of the mentoring.
Because of the mentoring, and that ties in with the use of a rubric for observations and.
Right.
And
what's the caseload for the mentor teachers?
it started between 15 and 20. I think it's a little bit higher this year. But then as far as advice, I would say, again, that any decision you make about how you run your schools or what you're going to do in your classrooms is going to be better informed if you bring together all the professionals who are going to be engaged in that project, in that process. And so you've got to have collaboration. You've got to have, in order to have that though, you've got to have trust. And in order to have trust, you've got to have relationships. It is worth the time to talk with your teachers and for those conversations to occur between site administrators and district administrators and school personnel so that you know each other, you trust each other, and you can problem solve together.
Tell me a little bit though, because anyone can schedule a meeting, right? It's like professional development, time and frequency don't always make it real or make it work. How's the communication made real? How's it not turn into a dog and pony show or an obligation?
I think to some extent you have to change people's hearts. There has to be inherent respect from the administrators in the building towards the professionals in the building. And one of the things that we've been doing in our district over the last several years is looking at the personalities and the characteristics of the people who should be in those positions and doing a better job of ensuring that we have leaders at school sites who are respectful and professional with the other professionals in the building.
Interesting.
So let me just give you an example. If something was happening in a school, and Jean and the staff at the union were hearing a lot of that, it wouldn't be abnormal for them to call down to the district and say, listen, there's something going on in this school, can you check it out? And then as the superintendent and my staff, we were able to do that. And very often, I mean, it was a split. Very often, it might have been the administrator that really wasn't doing the things that were going to help and support what was happening in the classrooms every day. And so we'd kind of work with them to make sure they understood this is our agenda.
Right. Fascinating.
But you're right, the biggest impediment to success for any of these things is time. Our teachers do not have enough time to do proper planning, proper collaboration, proper work together, lesson studies, evaluating practice, sharing ideas. They do not have enough time to do the job at the level that we demand they do it.
Bill, if there are other chamber people here or listening in who want to try to do what you did in Texas, what would you tell them to do? What's the trick?
Well, I mean, I think aggressive advocacy is the reason that I'm here today. That's what we did and that's what we are. And I would quickly add for the Gates people here today that none of the proceeds from the major grant to be announced next week will be used for advocacy. It will be used simply for public awareness. So please note that. We'll fund the advocacy. Y'all can fund the public awareness.
Well, I want to say thanks to Jean Clements, MaryEllen, Elia, Bill Hammond, and Richard Rhodes for your candor and your reflection. I want to thank the Gates Foundation, Jen and Lindsay, and all the people who helped me get up here. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.